Hi everyone, thank you very much for watching this live event, which is the last lesson of the Spring Security Fundamentals stream, and we continue and finish our discussion on integration testing with Spring Security. I also have, of course, another promo code for you that I will share at the end of this event. It's again a promo code for a 100% discount for the Spring Security in Action, the book I wrote. And hopefully with this event, with this video, you will get all the basic fundamental knowledge that you need to learn further and understand any kind of detail and implementation you'd need to do with Spring Security. So of course that's not the whole Spring Security, because probably that's impossible and not even relevant to discuss about everything. And yes, if you would ask me, I don't even know all the details by heart, which is again irrelevant, because it's not meant to actually learn everything by heart. But in every technology, Spring Security in this case, but in any technology, when you learn it, you have some basic fundamental backbone information that you need to learn, and this is what I try to share with you. And once you learn that backbone information of that framework, that specific framework, be it Spring Security in our case, but you can discuss about Spring MVC or classical just Spring Context and AOP, or it can be Enterprise Edition, Jakarta EE, JPA Hibernate. Choose whatever you'd like, is the same thing. You learn some basics, and then you will be able to use any detail, and you'll be able to go into the documentation, read the references, and use that framework. And that's what I'm trying to share with you. And I really hope that I did a great job. And with the Spring Security Fundamentals stream, you found all the basic details that will help you further go into the documentation for any and understand any other detail you'd need to work with your applications. Now, that's not the end, of course. I will still answer the questions. I will still be here, and I will start other streams. And the next one will be probably a one on software architectures, because many of you asked for it. But again, I'm still here for all my videos. So when you will leave me a comment, or you will find me on LinkedIn, or you will find me on Twitter, and we can discuss there as well. And I do recommend to follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter, because you will find other interesting things like articles or new versions released and so on. You would like to be the first informed about anything that's relevant, then you can follow me on Twitter or on LinkedIn or on both of them, and I will make sure to share with you all the details besides my videos that I create here. With that being said, let's step into the code and discuss about the last things we want to say in this chapter, which is the integration testing with Spring Security, and finish the stream. So let me share you my screen. And if you remember, we discussed already some things about mocking users in testing authorization. We only discussed the endpoint authorization with Spring Security, and it remained that we discussed today. First of all, we'll finish the ways in which you can declare mock users. We still have one possible approach that we didn't discuss yet. And then we will step into testing the method authorization rules. And I still remember it was one of the questions you had during my lesson during my previous lesson. Somebody asked, do we also have the possibility to test to integrate to write integration tests for our authorization on the methods? Yes, we can. We will do this today. I promised you that, and it was part of my program already. So we will do this today, and then we'll discuss a little bit about authentication, testing the authentication, which, as you will see, is a little bit less relevant than authorization. That's why I left it at the end. And with this, we will consider our entire Spring Security Fundamentals stream ended. And again, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned a lot of things, and I hope you will still be here on this channel, because again, I will continue with other nice streams on different related topics, and I will share with you all my knowledge from all my experience, which is quite some experience with plenty of projects I worked with for different roles. Yeah, what you see here is a diagram from my Spring Security in action. I will use it because I wanted to spare some time and avoid drawing it again. Is what we will start with today in mocking the users for security integration tests. We discussed about the approach with using the mock user and with user details. Thank you very much for your appreciations. Of course, I forgot to tell you at the very beginning, you can anytime use the live chat. I have an eye on the live chat and you can ask me questions, but you probably knew that. Yeah, and what we discussed is integration, is creating the mock users with mock user annotation and with user details. But I also told you that you have an even more flexible approach of creating the users by completely mocking your authentication in the security context. Because if we go back, you will see that you can create the mock user with mock user annotation, but the security context itself will be managed by the framework. So you don't create yourself the security context. But what happens if you need to have a specific authentication type? I've seen that used in real world examples. I have seen a project that was using a specific implementation of the authentication contract. If you remember, at one of the first lessons of this Spring Security Fundamentals stream, we discussed about the authentication contract, and you know that you implement the authentication contract to define that object which will store in the end the authentication, the authenticated user details. So it's representing both the authenticated user during the authentication process, but also is the instance stored in the security context in the end, from where all the authorization rules take it to apply the different configurations you specify. So what happens if in your application you have a specific authentication and you rely on that? For example, you have in that authentication some specific details. You don't have to always implement authentication via a username or a password. Maybe you have some other kind of information that you used for your authentication, because you might have a different kind of application where your authentication is a simple fingerprint hash. So that's a different kind of authentication object implementation you have created for sure. And to test that, you won't be able to use a simple with mock user or with user details annotation, because those won't create the precise implementation of the authentication contract you need in your security context. So for that case, you need to create your own implementation, and still the testing framework for integration tests with Spring Security allow you that by using this with context factory, which creates, you specify your tests how to create the full security context, and that gives you the flexibility of even specifying the authentication type. And if you have a custom authentication, then you can do that. You can create a custom authentication, and then the test, of course, will use the security context, but that will be a completely custom security context you created for your tests. So that's more flexible than the other two approaches we discussed in the previous lesson. And of course, now I will step into the code and I will show you how to do that. So I have already copied the example we've created in the previous lesson, because I didn't want to rewrite again. It's anyway, if you remember, it's only a demo endpoint, so we don't have something special, and we have a couple of users defined and the endpoint authorization that we'll use as well at the very beginning. So we don't need to rewrite this, because it's not something special with it. And you see that we already have, and I wanted to remind you that we already have discussed the test in the previous lesson, where we used either the with mock user or the with user details. Now I won't use the with mock user anymore. I just want to create my custom user. So what happens in my case if I want to that one is actually is forbidden because it doesn't have probably the right authority. I don't actually remember very well what we did here last week, but we will anyway rewrite the tests. So what I want here is to replace this with mockuser annotation with the more flexible approach of creating our own security context. And let's do that. For that, I usually create another security config or something package inside my tests here, and I have first of all to define my custom annotation. So I have to define an annotation of my own that where I can actually take some specific, if I want details that might be important, that might be relevant on my for my implementation, for my app. So how do we call it? I'm not very inspired today, so I will just call it with custom user, but of course maybe some other names would be better in case of an application. And if you want to declare an annotation, you have to use the interface keyword, but you have to also prefix it with this nice @ here. And when you do something like this, this now becomes an annotation that you can use by default on all the elements. You can use it with methods, but you can also use it on fields, parameters, classes, so on and so forth. So first thing, when I discuss about annotations, I'm not discussing now a lot about annotations in this lesson, but I want to tell you some things again. Maybe I repeat them, but it's always better to remind them. So first of all, when you use annotations, make sure that when you define your custom annotation, wherever that is, make sure that you specify very well the target. By default, the annotation can be applied everywhere. You don't want that. You really want to specify where is precisely this annotation usable. So in my case, I should only be able to use it on methods, because this annotation will only be used to mark specific test methods, and with this annotation in the end, as you will see, my test will be able to take some custom user from my custom security context that I will create. So because of that, I use the target, and that happens in any case. When I define an annotation, I use the target annotation itself just to specify which are the elements on which I can use that custom annotation I create. That's something, again, from the syntactical point of view, not needed, but from the best practices point of view, always a good option. So you have to do that. And then keep in mind that in Java you have annotations that they are usable on 3 levels, and one of them is the source code, then is the bytecode, and the third one is the runtime. So by default, an annotation can only be used on the source code, and it's not even available in the bytecode. So what does that mean is that Spring won't be able to use it at runtime by default. If you want an annotation to be usable at the runtime, again, this is not Spring related, it's just functionality, Java functionality related, you always need to specify the retention policy. So the retention policy needs to be runtime if you want your application to be able to use this annotation at runtime. Otherwise, this annotation won't even be in the bytecode in the end. So keep in mind that always when you expect some application to use some specific annotation at the runtime, you need to explicitly specify the retention policy. Now, we have our custom annotation, and of course, you can use it already. So you can just say with custom user here, with custom user. So it's my one. So you can do that, and it's working. But what happens is that, of course, if you don't provide some specific link of this annotation to your Spring Security implementation, this is doing nothing. So you basically need to link somehow with custom user to the Spring Security and to the security context. And what we were discussing about is, of course, creating a security context, creating actually a security context that stores a specific authentication you create, and that means we need to create a class. I usually name it with security context factory That's also the name of the instance, I guess. So I need to say with custom security context factory or something like that, so that it's not the same name as my interface. But it's anyway a factory. A factory is a class that is used to create something, create some instances, defined by the classical design pattern, the factory method design pattern, where you have a specific method in this object creating another specific object. So that's a factory, and that's why we name it a factory. Now you need to implement the with security context factory interface, and this is the contract that you use to link this custom security, this security context factory, that you will create your custom security context, like in my diagram here. Now we are creating this factory here. So you create this factory that will create the security context that will be used by the test. So I have to also specify the annotation here, and that's the link between the factory and the annotation. With custom user was the name of my annotation, see it here. And then of course you need to define, to override the abstract method create security context. This is actually the factory method. Create security context is the method. Spring security will, actually the tests will call first at the initialization when they will create the security context. They will not create now a mock security context of their own. They will just call this method and they will get the security context you define. And that's how you are very flexible in basically creating your own security context, which might contain your own authentication implementation. So that's pretty easy now, because you can just say here security context is security context holder, and you can create an empty context. So I've just created my empty security context. It doesn't contain anything now. I return it, and of course for my testing purposes I will have to add in this security context some kind of authentication. And in this specific lesson I won't create anymore a custom authentication because it takes too much time and we don't want to lose time with that. But I will still use an implementation of authentication that Spring Security provides. But keep in mind that usually when you use this third approach that's very flexible, you don't use it just to use another username and password implementation. You use it to be able to use your own authentication contract. So in my case I will just say authentication A is, and then username password authentication token is that implementation we've used a long time ago in one of our first lessons. And then here it is, you just say your user, your password is irrelevant, and then you can have some authorities if you'd like. And let's say this bill has the authority read, and then in the context you simply set this authentication. So this is how you create your custom security context for the tests. I've just created now a custom security context that contains a user bill with the authority read, and that's what my tests will use now if I use this. Can you use the context annotation to get security context? The @context annotation. The security context, from what I know, is not linked to the context annotation, but to the actually you can get the Spring context by that. So I would say I would answer with a no to your question, but I'm not 100% sure, because honestly I don't often use the security context directly in my apps. So if they at some point implemented something like that, I might have skipped it. But from my experience, I would say I would answer with a no. Again, maybe it's good to take a little bit of a research and see if something didn't change in the meantime. But from what I know, for the moment, it's not possible. Okay, anyway, in this case, you don't anyway want to inject the security context. You want to create a new one. You anytime want to create a new one. So that's why you use this approach to be flexible into creating a security context with a custom implementation for the test. So that in this case, you will always basically create an empty context and then just set there your authentication. That's why we use this approach. And now we need to go also back here and use the with security context and specify which is the factory class we use with this annotation. So it's in this case, when we will use in the test, we use the with custom user. So maybe you are wondering if when Spring calls this method and intercepts the custom annotation we created, how does Spring get to know to use the custom security context? Well, of course, that's why on the annotation itself we need to use this with security context, because now when Spring will get to call this method, we'll find this custom annotation, we'll see this annotation is annotated with security context, and that's how the tests will know that we want them to use this specific security context and not create a default one. So that's how the tests basically, just by intercepting the annotation, they then know they will use a specific custom security context, because basically the Spring will find this annotation, then we'll test that the annotation is annotated with security context, and then we'll find this parameter and we'll call this method here, creating the custom security context and using then the custom security context for authentication. So that's the whole flow from the test to achieving a custom security context instance that the test will then use. So with this, now what I did is I will always, when running this, I will always use a user build that has authority read. Let's go a little bit in the configuration and see what we said here. So we said here that all the requests need to have the authority read. So if all the requests need to have the authority read, it means that this authentication will actually work. It's not forbidden. If we want it to be forbidden, this one should be a different authority than the one we expect here, and in that case we expect to be forbidden. So let's run it right now like this. So I changed in my mock security context, I changed the authority of the user. So now my authenticated user theoretically has the right authority. So having the right authority when calling the demo endpoint, the status of the response shouldn't be okay. It should be forbidden, like we said here. So we see that indeed the test now passes successfully. So that means that indeed our security context was used correctly, and we can also implement the successful test where we'll say test authenticated with a proper authentication, and then we expect it to be okay. And now the question comes, how do we do that? So you have two options to do that, but one of them is, from my point of view, the wisest. So I will tell you about both, but you can choose whichever you'd like. But I will show you how to use the one that I consider to be the best. And you can, of course, one of the ways is to just create a second annotation and then create for it a second factory. You can do that and it will work. So we just anytime, anyway, the annotation is linked to the factory, so you can have as many custom annotations linked to as many factories as you'd like, but that requires too much amount of work. What you can actually do is, using the same custom annotation and implement in the same factory a specific logic that tells you how to create actually the security context and the authentication inside the security context. So in my case, I would do the smart thing of going here and add a property to my custom annotation, and I will just call it string authority. Okay, you can even give it a default value if you'd like, but in my case I will leave it without a default. Going back here, and of course now my annotations, they don't work anymore because both of them require the value for the parameter. So I will add the value for the parameter and I will say here is write, but here is read. And then you will wonder, okay, how do we now link the parameter to the custom security context? Well, remember that in the factory, you actually get here the annotation as a parameter. So it's very easy actually. You just have to write something like this. And now you have not only a custom annotation, but you have a custom annotation that takes some values that are used by the factory to create a specific custom security context for that specific test. And you can customize very easily what you want for your test. So in my case, I just wanted to say that a specific test should run and use a user having the authority write, while the other one should use the authority read. So for this one will fail because for write, according to our authorization rules at the endpoint level, for the write, the status is forbidden and we are not allowed to call the endpoint. But for the authority read, it should be okay. So let's just test if it's working now. We will run the full test class, and if we implemented everything correctly, then all the tests should be successful. And that's how we implement with the third and the most flexible approach the authorization tests for your endpoints. And you can see indeed our integration tests correctly passed. You see only green lights here, which is exactly what we expected to see. And you see that you have a lot of flexibility. Of course, you maybe wonder now, should we use directly the third approach because it's more flexible? Then why should we care about the other two approaches? Well, that's not necessarily that you need to use the third approach. My advice is always write as less code as possible to implement something. So as you can see, to implement this approach, it took us some code. We had to define our custom annotation, and we had to define a factory class and override the method and implement the logic of creating the security context ourselves. And if that's not needed in your case, so if you can just use with mockuser or with user details, depending on what you want to implement, the two other annotations which represent the two other approaches we discussed in the previous lesson, then I would tell you go with those, because you write less code, and writing less code is always better. You always have to keep in mind, writing more code is avoidable, repeating code is also avoidable. So you want to write your applications without repetition and with as less code as possible. Just think simple. So that's why this approach gives you the advantage. Its advantage is that it gives you the flexibility of creating your own security context, and then you decide here what kind of authentication implementation you have, which in some applications is mandatory, because if you rely on that specific authentication type for your implementations, for your authorization configuration, then it's important and it's the only way to go. But if you don't, then just use the easier approaches that we discussed in the previous lesson. And now you know everything you need to know about defining users. Second The second discussion of today's lesson is regarding testing the method authorization configurations, and again this is an important thing we take into consideration. To do that, we will create a second controller here so I don't screw up the tests I created for the demo controller. So let me just create a hello controller here, which is basically the same thing. It's just a very fast. I will create a REST controller, sorry, not here, a REST controller with the path hello, and we'll now implement the tests for this one. And this way we keep both implementations. And what I want to do basically, I don't want to only have the return hello here. I want to have a service class, and I will assume I create the service class. I just assume I create the service class that returns a specific name, and I will apply some authorization configurations using the global method security we discussed in one of the previous lessons. So I create the package services, and inside the services package I create a name service, sorry. I annotate it with service to mark this is a service, and I just create a method here that returns a string get name, and it always returns the same name. We don't care what is the name, and the difference is that we assume we apply a pre-authorize for it, and I will just say has authority read. So let's assume to call this method you need to have the authority read. So just a simple, we don't focus now. We discussed in detail pre-authorize, post-authorize, pre-filter and post-filter in the previous lesson, so we now don't want to focus on the pre-authorize itself. We choose the easiest authorization configuration. To call this method you need to have authority read. So let's test that, and then I will just say here comma plus, and we inject the name service. Generally I do use Autowired on the constructor, not with the field, which is not recommended, but you know that to make my implementation simpler in the examples I usually use it on fields. And it's the same thing anyway from the functionality point of view in our case, so we don't have to care about that. And we have now a new endpoint. And if I do something like this, instead of any request here, I will just say MVC. So MVC matchers for the demo will imply the authority is read, and for any request we permit all. So that actually means, and you can use a postman to check that, that actually means that for the demo endpoint we still apply the endpoint authorization configurations which force the user to have the authority read, so that this way the example 1 test class should still be working the same. If I call it now, I just call it so you see it's still working correctly, it's still passing all the tests. That this way we see that we didn't affect anything. But because of this any request permit all, as you probably know by now, that means that to call the hello endpoint you don't need to have any you don't need to have any user. Well, we don't actually need a permit all. We have an authenticated here because we assumed on the name service that we need to have an authority. So if I use the if I use the permit all, then I assume it can be unauthenticated, which means it might not have an authority. So I cannot actually use directly permit all, but still I don't have the has authority read. So this means that any user having some proper credentials for authentication will be able to call the hello endpoint. But because we applied this pre-authorize here, for which, by the way, we have to remember and never forget to enable global method security and specify that we want to use the pre-post annotations. Remember our previous lessons, because if you don't do that, it won't work, of course. And because of this, still, even if at the endpoint level I allow any authenticated user to call the hello endpoint, in the end, only those having authority read will actually be able to call it, because from the controller I go into the service and this method cannot be called by a user that doesn't have this authority, because this is the way I have applied my authorization configurations on the method level. Now, you can still use the mock MVC and test the endpoints the same way. You can do that. You have no reason why you couldn't do that. But if you want to directly test your methods in the service class just for the authorization rules at the method level, then you can do that as well. So I will copy this, and that will be our second example. And I don't need to have mock MVC anymore, because what I want to do now is directly injecting my name service class, and I will test. And actually I need a couple of methods. I will test with my test methods now directly the method getName. So I can just call it here, say name service getName, and this returns me the name and string actually. So why do I do that? Because in this situation I want to precisely go and test a specific method. Mind that this is not a unit test, it's still an integration test, because you still test the integration with Spring Security. Why? Because of this annotation here. Because of this annotation here, when you call the getName, you actually call not only the getName, but through that aspect provided by Spring, you will call basically first the global method security functionality that tests the authorization configuration here. So it's still an integration test, but it's an integration test that has a smaller boundary. You don't have to go through the controller if you simply want to test this layer of your application. Sometimes testing only the service layer of your application is more relevant for many reasons. Sometimes you don't even have endpoints. Come on, it doesn't have to be a web app. No, but you can still have Spring Security even if it's not a web app. You can still have a pre-authorize on a method. And in this case, you want to be able to still test the integration with your authorization configurations, and you can do that directly by injecting your name service, your service, whatever that is, in our case the name service. And for this one, the test unauthenticated demo endpoint, what we expect now is that when you call this method, you will get an exception, isn't it? That's what we expect. Because if I run it now, you will see the exception. So I don't have any user here. It's not authenticated at all. And we should see it failing at the very beginning. And we should even see the exception that's throwing. It's an unauthorized exception probably. It's actually a credentials not found exception, because you don't even have an authentication object in the security context. So you see? So that's basically what happens in this case when you don't even have it authenticated, but you try to call the method. So you can just say test unauthenticated. In this case, is not the endpoint, is the getName. And we leave it unauthenticated, and you just say assert throws. And we import the assert throws from assertions, I think it was, where you call this method and you then specify, you actually call the method and you specify the exception class. So in our case, we can just give it like this. and the exception class is this one here that you expect to happen. Okay, let's make it compile. So this is the executable here, and yeah, it doesn't look very well the way I put it now, but I think you understand it. So basically when this method is called, that's what is telling me, when this method is called, then this exception will be thrown. So that's why what I assert here. And now if I run it again, I should see that my test became green. And of course, now the second thing I'd like to do is test with an authenticated user. Now it's green. So we indeed asserted that we have this problem. And now we use the with mockuser. Any of the three approaches we discussed in the previous lesson and at the beginning in this lesson, so with mockuser, with user details, and with the custom user approach, with the custom security context approach, all three are usable. I will now use the with mockuser, which is the simplest, but you can rely on all of this that I have told you. And if I use with mockuser, if I remember correctly, it has a role by default but not an authority. So that means that I expect with mockuser to have, if I leave it like this, to have a forbidden. But what I will do, I will specify it explicitly here. So with mockuser having the authority right, so that's clearly against my authorization rule here. So if I call it like this, then I again have an exception that I have to assert. And I will first run it without to see that we have a problem, and you will see that in this case it should be an authorization exception, because that's now the user is authenticated. We have a user but it's not authorized. So see, access denied exception. You see that the exception changed indeed. This is the exception that happened because we didn't have a user at all. So it's an authentication exception. You didn't authenticate at all. But now by applying this annotation with mockuser, our test creates a mock security context having a user having the authority right we specified here, and now it's no longer an authentication problem because now you theoretically have a user. The problem is that the user is not according to our authorization configurations here. So as you can see here, I have defined it with authority right, but my method expects authority read. So that's why I have a problem. And you basically do the same thing here. You assert the exception, just that you have to assert a different exception. Of course, you have to assert the authorization exception instead of the authentication one. So let's run again both of the tests and see that they are still working. And then the third and the last test we want to implement is the one in which, of course, the user can access and everything is successful. So you see now both tests are correct, and the last one where we have a successful call test and without proper test unauthenticated get name test, I would say here as a name test authenticated get name without proper authority. Never forget that in real world scenarios you need to use the display name, so never write too long names for the methods. Use the display name annotation to describe what the test is, what the test is. And now if the authority is read, so now this is basically with a proper authority. Even the name is not needed here, proper authority. And in this case, we simply test that we get the name and it has the correct value, of course. So assert equals expected Mary and the actual. If I remember, Mary was, yeah. And all of the tests should now be working. So this is how we test the authorization configuration integration with Spring Security for the authorization configurations at the method level. And now you know both how to test your authorization configurations at the endpoint level, how to test them at the method level, so you can do either of these. And the last thing we'd like to discuss now is the possibility of testing as well the authentication. I said at the very beginning, authentication is less important. You usually have to write only one test and then everything else is authorization, because you generally don't have a lot of authentication possibilities. So you have one, maybe two possibilities, maybe three, but come on, how many authentication possibilities would you have? How many authentication fashions you have implemented for only one app? So in general, it's only one. So that's why you write a test for it, and that's enough. And you don't need to actually write a test for your authentication for absolutely every case, because that's actually why Spring Security offers you the possibility to directly test the authorization by skipping all this. Everything you see in gray here on this diagram is skipped, for example, when you use the with factory method, because when you test only the authorization configuration, Spring Security directly creates you somehow the security context, and the test uses that mock security context. It doesn't go through the authentication anymore. And again, that's relevant because it's not relevant to just test every time the authentication logic. It's any way, if it doesn't work once, it doesn't work for any other authorization rules. So simply by separating them, you make your tests faster, and that's what I recommend you. But let's see, if you would like to write also a test for your authentication, what would you do? Let me actually, I don't want to forget to change. I copied from the previous lesson, as I've told you at the very beginning. And when I will commit it, I want to commit it with the proper name. So you will have, of course, my project as usual on my GitHub account. And the link is always in the comment section of each video. So what I want to do here is test the authentication. So let me just create a third class for this. So I create the third class, paste it. And I don't have so many things to do here. Let me start with a method. And I'm still working with actually auto configure mock MVC here, because when you do test your authentication, you have to go through the endpoint. So you have to actually call it like a client to be able to authenticate, to be needed to authenticate. So you then need to use again Spring MVC if you are working on a standard app, web client, test web client if you are working on a reactive app. By the way, all these approaches I present you, I won't do them again, but you can use them on reactive apps as well. Just that for the endpoints, of course, you won't be able to use mock MVC. In that case, you will need to use test web client instead, but it's the same thing. So private mock MVC, and I get my mock MVC here. I don't need the service anymore directly. And what I actually do, I will test. Let's actually take the demo endpoint, because here we have the not only the authentication, but we have also the authorization rule at the endpoint. And I can just say something like this. So this is basically my test on authenticated demo endpoint, and I just try to perform it. It will give me a forbidden. That's what I expect. But what if I test an authenticated demo endpoint like this? Well, in this case, you can actually, after the get method here, not perform, after the get method here, you will say with, and then you provide, for example, a user you'd like to have for your authentication. So that's what you can do. So with, for example, you can say with mockuser. That would be one of the things you can say. And in this case, let me think about, so I'm still on the authorization, but I can also use with HTTP basic. In my case, it's HTTP basic, isn't it? Basic. Okay, and then you have to provide here your username and password. And if we want this to be forbidden, then we need to what? We need to specify the one with the wrong authority. So Bill has a right. Bill is right, so Bill is what we use here. So we use Bill with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that should be forbidden, isn't it? Because we provide an authentication, but the authorization is still forbidden. And let me check it to be sure. So that would be an authenticated without proper authority. Let's call it like this. Okay, it's green. And then if we want it to work, so again we test with the authentication, with a proper authentication, then I'm going and do you see that I'm precisely using the existing, the users existing in my user details service? And that's because now again I'm testing authentication. So that's why I need to use here, hey, HTTP basic. The reason is because I'm telling my test how to authenticate. So now I'm actually going through all this, including the gray ones. So it's basically testing the whole flow, the whole authentication flow that you have learned from the very beginning of this Spring Security stream. So that's why I need to specify how to authenticate, and I need here to have not any user. It needs to be a user from my user detail service. It needs to be a user known by my application. It needs to be a real user in this case. So that's John in my case, and John should be okay, isn't it? Because John is a user, and at the same time it has authority read, which should allow him to call the demo endpoint. So this one, I can call both of them here. And then I will go a little bit through all the possible things you can write here in the with before ending our stream. Because in some cases, and I would say that in many cases, you won't actually use HTTP basic. Of course, sometimes you still use HTTP basic, but it happens a lot today that HTTP basic is not the way to go. So what happens in the case you don't want to use HTTP basic, but you would like to use, for example, a JWT implementation. So then you would have here actually a JWT that you can use, and instead of saying with HTTP basic, then you just call JWT instead of with HTTP basic, and that will create you automatically an authentication based on a mock JWT and validate the authentication and use it this way to validate the authorizations further. So I guess I just replied to your question, how to test the authentication with JWT. So that's the way. That's the way. If you have a resource server, instead of using HTTP basic, then you use JWT. If you have a resource server, that's how you go with it. And the JWT will take care of creating everything that's needed behind. You don't need to take care of anything. You just need to use the method, and it will automatically create the security context and the authentication behind. Super. And if you have an opaque token which doesn't happen often, but sometimes it happens, remember the opaque token is that kind of token where we don't store the details. It's the opposite of the JWT, which is an implementation of a non-opaque token. JWT was an implementation of a token that contains inside details. The opaque tokens was something like an UUID, where you don't have the details and usually the resource server needs to call the introspection endpoint of the authorization server for that. If you have such an implementation, of course, you also have the possibility to call this opaque token method that will create you a security context with a proper authentication based on an opaque token. So you can even have opaque tokens and implement the integration test with Spring Security for your authentication. So that's great. You can basically do whatever you'd like. And with that being said, I think I've covered all the fundamentals that you need to know. Again, that doesn't mean I've covered everything in Spring Security, because that would mean I would cover some thousands of pages, and a lot of these are not that relevant to learn by heart. But I can say, and I'm really confident to say that I've managed to actually teach you lesson by lesson everything that's fundamental, and that means everything you, the developer, need to know to be able then to go and use something more specific from the documentation, from the reference, if you want. In these 34 lessons, 34 hours approximately, we managed to discuss all the very fundamentals of Spring Security, including the OAuth part and everything. They will change, of course, but if you learn this, I promise you, you will be able to understand any kind of Spring Security implementation. And when you have some detail that is not part of the fundamentals, you will be able to go into the reference and understand how that goes. And hopefully this series of lessons will be very helpful for you and for others in the very near future. Will, of course, I will still be here, and I'm just starting a new stream, but my channel is not ending, so I'm still seeing your comments, and I'm still waiting you to reach me on Twitter and LinkedIn if you'd like. And of course, follow me in the next streams where we'll discuss more nice and fantastic things. Now, before ending, of course, I promised you a new promo code, and the last promo code I will share you for an ebook for Spring Security in Action. So what you need to do if you want to try to use this promo code, I say to try to use because again it's only usable once, so only the first of you who will be the fastest will actually be able to take the ebook. If you don't want the ebook, leave the others to take it. And by the way, again, it's only usable for the ebook, the code, so you can't get the printed book, it's just for the ebook. So what you have to do is just go in the Manning site, I have shared you the link, and you add the ebook Spring Security in Action to your cart, and then you just press pay, but instead of paying, you have there a field where you have to use a voucher code. And if you use the voucher code I'm sharing with you now, that will give you a 100% discount. So the first of you who will use the code will get the ebook. Of course, yeah, this is the code, and I hope actually many of you will actually read the book. And when you read the book, when you read the book, if you like the book, just don't forget to also leave me a nice 5-star review on Amazon or on Manning, on O'Reilly Learning. You can find the book in plenty of places nowadays. So when you read it, if you like it, don't also forget to leave me a review. With that being said, thank you again for being here with me, and stay tuned for my next lessons. Stay tuned for my next streams that I will start soon. And don't forget to find me on Twitter and LinkedIn, because you will find that sometimes I will be in some other places, podcasts, maybe on the Manning Twitch channel. And if you'd like to see those videos as well, I'm always sharing them on Twitter and on LinkedIn, so follow me there as well. Thank you very much and have a great time for study.